Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Oberhelman, and along with my colleague Barbara Miller over here, we're the co-organizers of the Great War and its Legacy series. This is an ongoing series of talks commemorating the centenary of World War I. And today, we're going to have the first of two that we'll be having in the spring semester. We're very honored to have Dr. Thomas Carlson. He's an assistant professor of history and specializes in Middle Eastern history. Dr. Carlson has his PhD from Princeton University, and he graduated in 2012. And then he received a postdoc to work on the Digital Humanities, Digital History project, the Syriac Gazetteer, along with his colleague David Michelson from Vanderbilt University. And his specialty is actually a little bit earlier than World War I. He focuses upon the Middle East and the interreligious interactions during the medieval period, and he's working on his first book on Christian-Muslim intersections during the 15th century in Mesopotamia and Iraq. So, hand it over to Dr. Carlson now. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the invitation to speak here, and thank you all for coming. It is a privilege to speak to you today. And that may be the last uplifting thing that I get to say today, but that is the nature of working with the past. World War I, the Great War, is often dated from 1914 to 1918, but in the Middle East it started earlier and ended years later. Many of the conflicts that seem intractable in the Middle East today owe part of their development to the conduct of the war and its aftermath. On this subject, there's an abundance of misinformation, and many self-appointed experts continually inform us that the Middle East has always been a hotbed of sectarian instability and violence. Those pundits ignore the past. The Middle East became a hotbed of sectarian instability and violence, mostly within the last century. And it has developed in that way for particular reasons due to particular causes. A historian seeks to clarify what those causes were. Why do we care? The Middle East today is a mess, and we may care simply out of human compassion. But even people without compassion need to understand these causes due to the challenges that Middle Eastern instability poses to the international system and to global security. If we do not understand the past, our present policies are doomed to failure, and we will only escalate current violence. A more accurate understanding of the past can save lives in the present and the future. Don't let anyone tell you that history doesn't matter. Two themes will inform this discussion of the Great War in the Middle East. First, how Europeans influenced, both directly and indirectly, the development of the Middle East. And second, how problems that we are now told are age-old conflicts, in fact, developed only in the last century. Now, the context of the Great War in the Middle East developed slowly during the 1800s as Europeans increasingly intervened politically, militarily, and financially in the Middle East. I could spend a whole lecture just on this topic, but I won't. Let me just show you the map of the Middle East in circa 1700, before European involvement. There were two empires, the Ottoman Empire in the west and the Persian Safavid Empire in the east. These two empires occasionally fought wars, but in the 2 centuries between 1700 and 1900, both Europe and America fought more wars than the Middle East did. Both Europe and America were more violent than the Middle East was in these 2 centuries. The Middle East certainly had its own problems, but it was comparatively peaceful. Now I'll show you a map of the Middle East in 1914. Notice first the green line that indicates the earlier extent of the Ottoman Empire, curving up and including the Balkans there. It's a bit inaccurate. The Ottomans had also controlled the Crimea, which is right here, before it was annexed by Russia, not for the last time. But this map shows how in the 1800s both France and England were annexing, taking over significant portions of the Ottoman Empire. This map does not show the states of the Balkans in southeastern Europe, which is unfortunate. In the 1800s, parts of the Balkans were annexed by Imperial Russia, up here, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right on the edge of the Balkans. Other parts of the Balkans had rebelled against Ottoman rule, but their revolts would not have been successful had it not been for help from the European great powers, from France, from England, from Austro-Hungary, and from Russia. Now, this is the Ottoman Empire and how it was already being dismembered by Western Europe before the Great War started. The Persian Empire experienced European intervention differently. In theory, it was independent. But the Russians and the British had agreed not to interfere with the other European powers' political, financial, and military pressure on the Persian territory. Here's a 1907 British political cartoon illustrating the situation. The British lion says to the Russian bear, "You can play with his head, and I can play with his tail, and we can both stroke the small of his back." How did the Persian cat feel about this? The phrase, "the great game," was used by the British to describe the diplomatic and military competition between Russia and England for control of Central Asia. The phrase accurately captures European attitudes towards control in the Middle East as well, and we will see those attitudes play out during and after World War I. Now, the Great War started somewhat earlier in the Middle East than it did in Europe. You may have heard that World War I started in June of 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir of the throne of Austria-Hungary. But many people in the Ottoman Empire might have dated the war's beginning 3 years earlier to September 1911. The Austrian Archduke still lived, but the Italians were afraid of being left out of the European race for empire. In late September, Italy attacked Tripoli, which is right here, and refused to negotiate. So the Ottoman army defended the province. On one occasion, after a minor defeat, Italian troops targeted civilians and a mosque in Tripoli. The fighting ended in October 1912 with a humiliating defeat for the Ottoman Empire and the loss of this province, yet another instance of European annexation. Before the end of the war with Italy, war broke out in the Balkans. I'm not talking about 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria still lived. But 4 Balkan states, which were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, jointly attacked the land still governed by the Sultanate. And this is all still part of the Ottoman Empire land. And this region is attacked, as you can see, by Greece in the south and by Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro in the north. Within 7 months, the Ottomans had lost almost all their territory in Europe. Then the victorious Bulgarians decided to attack their Greek and Serbian allies. And in the ensuing struggle, the Ottomans regained a very small amount of territory, of their European territory. So on the whole, the Balkan Wars were a catastrophic loss for the Ottoman Empire. By the end of the fighting, in August of 1913, perhaps 2.5 million Turks had fled or been expelled from the lost territory into the Ottoman capital and into its remaining territory in Anatolia, what we today call Turkey. So when the Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in June of 1914, the Ottoman Empire was still struggling to resettle a large influx of refugees from its recently lost territory. As the sides coalesced in late summer and early autumn of that year, the position of the largest empire in the early Eastern Mediterranean likewise took shape. Why did the Ottomans enter the war? And why did they enter on the side they did? There was indeed some lively debate in the Ottoman parliament about whether to enter this European conflict or not. If they were to enter this war, they could choose between the side of the Serbians, who had just defeated them in the previous year, and the side of the Austrians, who had annexed Bosnia from them only 6 years earlier. Neither side looked very appealing, maybe. Yet England had occupied Egypt, France had occupied Tunisia, and Russia, which was Serbia's main backer in the spat with Austria, had driven the Ottomans out of much of the Caucasus and all around the northern Black Sea. Russia had made it known that it hoped to restore a Christian Byzantine empire based in Constantinople, which was currently occupied by the capital of the Ottoman state. On the other side, Germany was Austria's main supporter, and Germany had built Ottoman infrastructure without taking control of Ottoman territory. If the Ottomans were to enter the war, there wasn't much question as to where most of their adversaries lay. But it was debated whether they should enter this war at all, and some parts of the Ottoman parliament indeed advised against it. I think the reason they entered this European conflict may be seen on November 1st of 1914. Only 2 days after the Ottomans declared war, a Russian commander had led an expeditionary force into the Ottoman Empire. One might be forgiven for thinking that the Russians intended to invade the Ottoman Empire whether it entered the war first or not, as it takes more than 2 days to muster an expeditionary force to the Caucasus Mountains. I'm not a military expert, but that's my impression. The Ottoman decision to go to war probably had more to do with rivalry with the Russian Empire over a century old than with any of the other factors. And leading Ottomans may well have concluded that they would have more war whether they declared it first or not. For comparison, the Persian Empire tried to stay out of this war, but both the Russians to the north and the British, based in India to the southeast, ignored Iranian neutrality and used the empire's land as a military staging ground from which to attack the Ottomans. In retaliation, the Ottoman Empire attacked cities in northwestern Iran, resulting in heavy civilian losses. The European powers did not allow the Persian Empire to remain neutral. This is how what we call World War I began in the Middle East. Although it was in some ways simply a continuation of the wars that had started with Italy's seizure of Libya and the Balkan states' conquest of Ottoman lands, the Europeans did not allow Middle Easterners to maintain neutrality when the Europeans fought each other. The Great War also lasted longer in the Middle East than anywhere else. An armistice was signed in October 1918 when the British and French occupied Constantinople and took effective control of the Ottoman Sultan. And that armistice is often considered the end of the war. 1918, that's a good time for the end of the war. But at the same time, the Greeks invaded Anatolia in March, actually of 1919, after the armistice. And the Greek invasion was intended to put into effect the Allies' agreement to dismember the remaining Ottoman lands among the victors. A Turkish nationalist army based in Ankara in central Anatolia, which is, I think, there, if I'm not mistaken. A Turkish nationalist army was led by General Mustafa Kemal, and it disavowed the Ottoman Sultan and fought what Turks have come to call the War of Independence. And this is a map of the War of Independence. Turkish nationalist resistance to French occupation in the south forced the latter to withdraw from Anatolia. The Russians in the northeast had already withdrawn as a result of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. The Arab majority lands of Syria and Iraq, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire, were not part of the nationalist program of Mustafa Kemal. A Turkish national army overcame there was an Armenian Republic here in the northeast. But the biggest threat to the notion of a Turkish national state was the Greeks. The and this is the area that the Greeks attacked. The Greco-Turkish War ended with the Turks defeating the Greeks toward the end of 1922 and driving them out of Anatolia. A peace treaty was only formally accepted in 1923, and some elements of the resulting settlement were not concluded until 1926. 1926 may be taken, or at least 1923, as the end of World War I from a Middle Eastern perspective. Now, I think time will run out if I attempt to recount all the details of this long war. For the purpose of seeing the war's legacy in the Middle East, only two wartime developments must be understood. The first is the issue of genocide. Genocide is not just large-scale massacres. Genocide is a deliberate attempt to wipe out a defined people as a whole, so that there will be no one left from that people. In discussing the genocidal programs of the Great War, the most important word you will hear me say is the word some, not all. Before the war, large areas in what is today eastern Turkey had mixed populations, primarily Armenians and Kurds, and some areas of what are today western Turkey and far northeastern Turkey had large Greek populations. Some Armenian nationalists hoped to create an Armenian nationalist state in their region. Some Armenians hoped that the Russian Empire would incorporate their regions, which they imagined would give them an advantage over their Muslim neighbors. Some Turkish nationalists, including some in very high positions of authority, regarded all Armenians as potential traitors behind their lines. Beginning in April 2015, orders were sent to the governors of the central and eastern provinces to deal with the Armenian question. Now, Turkey today claims that the orders were simply the deportation of the Armenians away from the front lines of battle, whereas Armenia claims that there was a policy of genocide. What is indisputable is that somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died. What happened to cause these deaths is very complicated. Some military units escorted Armenian civilians on death marches through deserts with no food or water. Others marched Armenian civilians around a hilly corner into a Kurdish ambush. Others just killed Armenians directly. Other Turkish soldiers defended Armenian civilians from Kurdish attacks. Some Turkish commanders refused to obey the orders, objecting, they said, to accompanying non-written orders to destroy rather than to deport. Some Kurds attacked the Armenians, while other Kurds protected their Armenians from the Turkish army. Some Turkish members of parliament objected to the policy, calling out the government's order to murder the Armenian subject population. Some Armenians fought, some escaped, some survived, and some converted to Islam. This was clearly a complex event. It seems sufficiently well established to most historians, including increasing numbers of Turkish historians, that the mass murder of Armenians was the goal sought by some of the ruling Turkish party. This is the Armenian Genocide, which still today, a century later, is the reason why Armenia and Turkey cannot be allies. Now, how are we to understand this? First, I think it is important not to understand it as it was understood by Americans at the time. Americans informed of these massacres as they were happening ascribed them to a supposedly inherent barbarism of the Turkish race, and thought that all Turks, including those who had opposed this policy, should be collectively punished for this crime. But the different reactions among Turks to the policy of Armenian genocide shows that this is not an inherent racial characteristic. Nor was it a racial hatred of Armenians as such, since Armenians were not the only victims of genocide. Some Turks massacred some Kurds as part of the same program. Substantial numbers of Assyrian Christians, another minority population in what was then Ottoman Mesopotamia, were also massacred by Ottoman troops. Religion may have played a role in some cases, but that would not explain the attacks on Kurds, who were just as Muslim as the Turks were. And indeed, Turks were not the only perpetrators. Some Kurds participated in attacks on Armenians. Turks themselves had suffered ethnic cleansing in the Balkans 3 years earlier. I mentioned earlier the millions of refugees which streamed into Constantinople and Anatolia as a result. When the Greek army invaded Anatolia in order to seize large portions of it, they pursued a policy of ethnic cleansing against Western Anatolian Turks in 1919. Upon their withdrawal in 1922, the Greek army adopted a scorched earth policy, while the Turkish Nationalist Army, no longer the Ottoman army, committed systematic massacres of Greek Ottoman subjects in Western Anatolia when they reoccupied the region. Genocide was not rare during World War I, and it was not distinctive to only one ethnic group. Instead, we might consider genocide not only as physically enabled by modern military and communications technology, but imaginable because of modern ethno-nationalism. The European ideology of nation-states being the sole legitimate form of government was dangerous in a region with an entrenched mixed population. Before the influence of European nationalism upon the Middle East, there had been no attempts at genocide under Persian rule, Roman rule, or indeed Islamic rule. Everyone in the multi-ethnic and multi-religious Ottoman and Persian empires accepted that the ruler would be different from the majority of the subjects. That's normal. Before World War I, many people in various ethnic groups were looking for governmental autonomy in the regions inhabited by members of their ethnicity. This is nationalism. The only problem was that the regions inhabited by Turks substantially overlapped with regions inhabited by Greeks or by Kurds or by Armenians. A nationalist logic would necessarily view people of other ethnicities as an obstacle to legitimate government. And in a time of war, killing them may come to appear to some nationalists as the logical solution. This nationalist logic is revealed by the 1923 Lausanne peace settlement, which finally ended the war in the Middle East. The nascent Turkish Republic and the Greek Republic agreed to an exchange of populations, by which over 1 million Greeks from Anatolia and 500,000 Turks from Greece were expelled to the other country. Now, the definition of Greek actually meant Eastern Orthodox Christian, regardless of whether the people spoke a word of Greek or not, or thought of themselves as Greek or not. Similarly, the definition of Turk simply meant Muslim, whether the person understood any Turkish. Ethnicity was explicitly defined to be religion. This exchange led to an economic drag on both Greece and Turkey after World War I, with the large number of refugees that came in. Yet both governments were well pleased with the creation of ethnically more homogenized nation-states. The population exchange may be viewed as an alternative to genocide for the creation of national homogeneity in the early 20th century. Now, modern people possess a certain chauvinism when they label massive violence as medieval. In fact, genocide is a distinctively modern crime, both technologically and conceptually. The Armenian Genocide was simply the largest in scale. Now, as a result of the genocides and population exchanges, the Kurds were the only substantial non-Turkish minority left in the new Turkish Republic. The victory of a European-style Turkish nationalism led to a government policy of cultural annihilation of Kurdishness. Kurdish language was prohibited in schools and in public, and Kurds themselves were misleadingly labeled Mountain Turks, the hope being that the new compulsory state education in Turkish would Turkify them. In the meantime, the Kurds had developed their own nationalism, encouraged by some British officers during World War I, and some of them sought an autonomous Kurdistan. They're still seeking it. Thus, the roots of the modern conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdish independence movement, which today holds hundreds of thousands of Kurds under martial law in southeastern Turkey, developed out of the triumph of nationalism in the wake of World War I. The other aspect of the Great War itself, which must be discussed, is the issue of British imperial promises. The British were humiliated by their defeat by the Ottoman army at Gallipoli in 1915. Afterward, the British sought to stir up various allies against the Ottomans, and they did so by making mutually conflicting promises. 3 in particular covered the land now occupied by the State of Israel. In the second half of 1915, the first of these promises, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, corresponded with the ruler of Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, Hussein, the son of Ali, to persuade the Arab leader to start a revolt against the Ottoman Sultan, who nominally ruled Arabia. Henry McMahon promised that the British government would recognize an independent Arab kingdom with whatever boundaries Hussein might propose, excluding only a thin coastal strip starting from the west of Damascus northward. This correspondence led to the Arab Revolt, which Westerners generally credit to T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, if you've heard the phrase or seen the movie. Now, Lawrence's own role in the revolt was far less significant than that of Hussein's own sons, Faisal and Abdullah. The promise to the Arabs is known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. A year later, in May 1916, an agreement was reached between 2 minor diplomats, Mark Sykes, representing the British, and François-Georges Picot, representing the French. This agreement meant that they agreed that the predominantly Arab areas of the eastern Mediterranean and Iraq might be partitioned between British and French influence and control. Direct British control would be in southern Iraq. You'd have direct French control along the Mediterranean coast and southeastern Anatolia. And there would be an internationally administered zone in Palestine. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. We will speak much more about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And finally, the third of these, at the beginning of November in 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, wrote a note to a British Jewish leader stating, and I quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." And then the declaration went on a bit longer, saying, as long as such an establishment would not intrude upon the rights of non-Jewish inhabitants in Palestine. This is the Balfour Declaration. Now, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement was leaked to the newspapers by the Bolsheviks in Russia, Henry McMahon resigned, citing the incompatibility between the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the promise he had made to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. 2 years later, at the Paris Peace Conference, Lord Balfour himself commented that these promises were contradictory, and fulfilling all of them was impossible. So how did these promises play out after the war? This is an illustration from a century earlier, but it shows Europeans carving up the world between themselves. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, namely the agreement between Europeans, was taken as the basis for the post-war settlement. An Anglo-French declaration in November 1918 declared its support for the governmental autonomy of all Middle Eastern peoples. Nevertheless, even after 1918, after the armistice theoretically ended the war with the Ottoman Empire, a British army proceeded to occupy the city of Mosul against the terms of the armistice. So this is the map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In accordance with Sykes-Picot, the San Remo Peace Conference in 1920 gave the French a mandate for Syria. So this is the area of direct French control, and this is the theoretical area of French influence. And the same conference gave the British mandates for Iraq, here, and Palestine and Transjordan, here. Now, in theory, a mandate was a new word. It was made up, first used in politics for this purpose. It meant control of an area until the people living there were ready to assume autonomous government, in theory. The original Sykes-Picot Agreement had envisioned international supervision of Palestine. That's what the yellow means here. While in the end, the British alone governed it. The French also received far less in the actual settlement than the Sykes-Picot had promised them. Their direct control of southeastern Anatolia was never realized. It was defeated by Turkish resistance and by the newly formed army of the independent Turkish Republic. The city of Mosul in northern Iraq, which is right around here, was originally promised to the French, but after the war, the British persuaded the French to give them Mosul. Why did the British want Mosul? Well, the Brits suspected, but they did not tell the French, that there were oil fields around Mosul. As it turned out, they suspected correctly. Now, Mosul was, and so these are the modern boundaries. Unfortunately, I couldn't fade out so you could see both at the same time. But you see the boundary of northern Syria corresponds to the earlier Sykes-Picot Agreement after the Turks had beaten off French direct control. And the line, which had gone straight up to the Iranian border, has now been shifted over. And so this is why northern Iraq is as lumpy as it is today. Mosul was also, however, claimed by the new Turkish Republic, even though it remained under British occupation. And so the League of Nations, newly constituted, decided to send a group of investigators to ask the people of Mosul province whether they were Turks or Iraqis. Now, these are options that in 1920 made no sense to most anyone in Mosul. There were a few Turks in Mosul, and a few people were from Iraq, but it would be kind of like taking a survey of people in Stillwater and asking, so all of you, are you Cherokee or Texan? Those are your two options. Obviously, there are a lot of other people in Stillwater. Most people in Mosul were neither Turks nor from Iraq. In the end, it was only in 1926 that the League of Nations decided the fate of Mosul, and they decided this in favor of the British. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, with a few adjustments, was the basis for the borders that we see today in the Middle East. Now, both the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence and the Balfour Declaration fared less well. An Arab leader named Faisal, who was the son of Hussein of Mecca, relying on the promises of Henry McMahon, He led the successful Arab revolt and set himself up in Damascus in 1918, where he was subsequently acclaimed king in 1920 by the democratically elected Syrian National Congress. The French, however, regarded this as a violation of their mandate. After all, if the Arabs were already self-governing under their chosen king, they would have no need for French tutelage. So the French shelled the city of Damascus in the summer of 1920 until Faisal of Mecca surrendered and left the city. So much for self-determination. The irony of the French destroying the existing Syrian democratic government in order to instruct the Syrians in autonomy was an irony lost on Western observers at the time. If the French were to instruct Middle Easterners in self-rule, it would be along the lines of a republic without a monarch, as the French themselves had. The British, by contrast, set up constitutional monarchies in Egypt, Transjordan, and Iraq, giving this last kingdom to the same Faisal of Mecca. Transjordan they gave to Faisal's brother, Abdullah, another son of Hussein of Mecca, while in Egypt they promoted the preceding ruler, who had ruled under nominal Ottoman authority. The boundaries of the different mandates resulted in several separate Arab states, which persist to this day despite occasional attempts at unification. I just find it astonishing how, in the decades following World War I, Middle Eastern people selected for themselves forms of government which just happened to mirror the governments of the mandatory powers of England and France. French mandates were republic. Mandates of the United Kingdom were kingdoms. Self-determination at its best. The French also introduced sectarianism into Syrian politics despite many Middle Easterners' resistance. In the area of Syria that was under the French mandate, France carved up no fewer than 6 states on which it imposed sectarian religious definitions. These included an Alawite state, a Druze state, and a Maronite state. This last we now call Lebanon. Alawites and Druzes are secretive religions which developed out of branches of Islam in the medieval period. Many people, both insiders and outsiders, consider these two groups no longer Muslim. Maronites, on the other hand, are an ancient Christian denomination native to the area who in the Crusader period had accepted Roman Catholic supremacy. The French thought that each of these states should be governed by a single religious group. They also played favorites. They were particularly favorable toward the Maronites, who were their fellow Christians. So when the French realized that the area that was previously dominated by Maronites in Lebanon was too remote and mountainous to be economically viable, they enlarged it. They attached this area to coastal areas which included the ports of Beirut and Tripoli, where Sunni Muslims were in the majority. So the resulting Lebanese state was precisely 51% Christian and only 29% Maronite. The French determined that people in this new Greater Lebanon could only vote within their religious group. And they guided the Lebanese to develop a constitution in which seats of parliament would be apportioned to religious groups according to population. The confessional system, as it was termed, worked well enough for about 4 decades of economic growth, which made Beirut the Paris of the East. But increasing numbers of refugees from Palestine to the south and the economic problems in the 1960s changed the demographics. By 1970, Christians were no longer a majority, but they still controlled a majority of the seats of the parliament. The resulting Lebanese civil war from 1975 to 1990 was a political war largely fractured upon sectarian lines, because this is how the French had set up the political system. Now, we must distinguish between sectarian identity, belonging to a particular religious group, and sectarian politics, making political decisions based on allegiance to a particular religious group. Sectarian identities had long existed in the Middle East, but they were rarely meaningful for politics. The French changed this by insisting on viewing the Middle East through a sectarian lens and inscribing that into democratic structures. A similar story of Europeans encouraging sectarianism developed in Iraq under the British mandate. The Brits, although they had not given the Assyrian Christians an autonomous state, organized a number of them into a militia called the Assyrian Levies. The British then used this Assyrian Christian militia to police the populations of Arabs and Kurds, after the anti-colonial Iraqi revolt of 1920. The Iraqi Arabs and Kurds came to view the Assyrian Christians as stooges of the colonial British power. And when the British ended the mandate in 1932, some massacres of Assyrians occurred as revenge for earlier perceived injustices. Sectarianism is not native to the Middle East. Other than Lebanon, Syria's several small states chafed under the French mandate with increasing levels of anti-French sentiment. And they all chose to give up their sectarian identities and reunite into the Syrian public, which was self-consciously multi-religious. There are those today who believe that the current Syrian civil war can be resolved by a sectarian partition of the country. Perhaps we should ask the Lebanese their opinion on the subject. Yet the French viewed it as their civilizing mission in Syria to teach these Middle Easterners how to be good Frenchmen and Frenchwomen. The French tried several different arrangements of mini-states and partitions, none of them leading to compliance on the part of the Syrians. Most of the Syrians just wanted the French to leave. And they elected presidents and parliaments who served Syrian interests rather than French interests. Now, the French, acting as the mandate power, repeatedly nullified elections, dismissed elected presidents, and dissolved the Syrian assembly. In 1936, the Syrian parliament and the French High Commissioner finally agreed on a treaty that would grant Syria self-determination and an ongoing alliance with France. But then the French parliament refused to ratify the treaty because they were worried about the Germans getting ahead. In 1938, the French also guaranteed that there would be ongoing tensions between Syria and its neighbor to the north, the Turkish Republic. And the French guaranteed this tension by giving the province of Hatay to Turkey against the wishes of the Syrian government. The Syrians today still claim this province. If you see a map of Syria made in Syria, that little lump where Turkey goes down, that's part of Syria, according to the Syrians. The French entirely failed to teach the Syrians how to conduct a docile, pro-European autonomous government. And Syrian independence from France was only achieved at the end of World War II due to British pressure. But lest you think that the British were all in favor of self-determination, England likewise sought control at the expense of democracy. Egypt was occupied by the British military already in 1882, in theory for a brief intervention. At the outbreak of World War I, the Brits unilaterally declared Egypt a sovereign state and a British protectorate. They already occupied the country. That meant that the British controlled all military, all foreign relations, and communications infrastructure within Egypt. Faced with an Egyptian nationalist uprising in 1920, in parallel with anti-colonial revolts across the Middle East, the British attempted to work out a deal with the Egyptians. But the British insisted on terms which were unacceptable to any Egyptian government. So 2 years later, giving up on the idea of a treaty, the British unilaterally declared Egypt independent. But this independence included continuing British military occupation, British control of the Suez Canal, British control of all communications infrastructure. In other words, Egyptian independence was an English fiction. It took another 30 years before a military revolution ousted the Egyptian king, who was widely regarded as a British puppet, and forced the United Kingdom to agree to remove their troops in 1956. In response to the military coup, the British decided to convince the State of Israel to attack Egypt, hoping to provide a justification for continued British military presence. This led to the Suez Canal the Suez Crisis, of 1956. Now, Egypt lost the war, but they won the diplomacy, and the British were forced to pull their troops out of Egypt permanently. But it was really British mismanagement of what was officially named Palestine that has perhaps proved to be the most enduring legacy of the Great War in the Middle East. The first British census of the region showed a population that was around 78% Muslim, around 11% Jewish, 10% Christian. Now, the implications of these numbers for any notion of representative democracy should be obvious, and they were obvious at the time. For that reason, Muslims and Christians, who generally identified as Arabs, generally pressed for immediate elections and a representative government. On the other hand, Zionist activists who sought the creation of a Jewish state which controlled Palestine, they sought to encourage Jewish immigration into what they called the land of Israel, and they sought to delay political independence and to delay representative voting until a Jewish majority could be achieved. Jewish immigration to Palestine was an increasingly sensitive political issue, as Muslim and Christian Arabs were concerned about losing their autonomy to a Jewish state. On the other hand, Arabs were neither politically united nor organized, while the official Zionist organization was conveniently headquartered in London, where it exercised more influence over British government decisions than even the British High Commissioner in far-off Palestine. So the British tried several solutions which satisfied no one. Perhaps the Jewish national home mentioned in the Balfour Declaration would contain only a small part of Palestine, proportional to the Jewish population, 11% of the land. The Zionist organization rejected this. Perhaps there could be formed a legislative council with some Jews and some Arabs, but the Brits insisted that half of the legislators should be appointed, not elected, appointed by the British government to ensure ongoing British control. This was rejected by the Arabs as undemocratic. Jews in Palestine were generally wealthier than Arabs due to foreign aid, particularly from Jews abroad, and this differential in wealth spread further bitterness on both sides. Officially, the British repeatedly prohibited Jewish immigration to Palestine, but it was rarely enforced tightly, especially after 1933, and the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany led to a marked spike in Jewish immigration to Palestine. A 1937 British report recommended partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and this idea was rejected by both Arab nationalists and by Zionists, for both groups claimed the whole of Palestine. The ensuing Arab revolt was brutally suppressed in 1939 by the British military with the help of some Jewish auxiliaries, although the British simultaneously declared all Jewish immigration to Palestine illegal. During the Arab revolt, one group of Jewish volunteers called Irgun engaged in retaliatory strikes, murdering uninvolved Arab civilians in response to other Arabs having murdered Jews. During World War II, the British again supplied Jewish paramilitary groups with military equipment in order to maintain the peace in Palestine, and illegal Jewish immigration continued to rise in light of the European Holocaust. Now, by the end of World War II, Jews as well as Arabs wanted the British out of Palestine, and the Jewish militia Irgun that I mentioned a moment ago engaged in terrorist tactics to achieve this, such as bombing the British military headquarters in Jerusalem. In 1947, the UK presented the Palestine dilemma to the newly formed United Nations, which proposed a bizarre partition by which a Jewish state would have a 51% Jewish majority and a substantial Arab minority, and most of the good farmland and the ports, while the Arab state would be 99% Arab and only 1% Jewish. This was not a fair division, and like so many other plans for Palestine, it satisfied no one. During the intercommunal violence of 1948, the following year, the Jews who had gained military equipment and training in World War II triumphed easily over the local Arabs, who had not recovered from the disaster of the Arab Revolt. The 1949 Declaration of the State of Israel and the ensuing international war with several of its neighboring Arab states marked the end of the British mandate, but it did not end the violence which resulted from an imperial power making rash promises and speaking out of both sides of its mouth during World War I. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which began during the British Mandate, continues today as one of the most intractable legacies of the Great War. According to some Western observers at the time, what was then called the Great War was presented as the war to end war, or the war to end all wars, it's sometimes said. The idea was that such a catastrophic war ought to convince any rational human being how horrible war is, and that universal human peace would dawn upon its conclusion. That was not the case even in Europe. And 30 years later, an even greater war forced Westerners to rename the Great War as simply World War I, because there had now been a World War II. In the Middle East, where the Great War started earlier and lasted later than in Europe, wartime violence and post-war settlement caused suffering even greater than that experienced by Europeans. A British military officer is quoted as saying about the 1919 Paris peace process, "After the war to end war, they seem to have been pretty successful in Paris at making a peace to end peace." Paris did not end the Middle Eastern War, but the provisions of the 1920 San Remo Conference and the 1923 Lausanne Conference gave the Middle East the groundwork for the chronic instability and intractable conflicts which characterize it today. The Great War shaped the Middle East not only by drawing the boundaries that we see on today's maps, but also by making the Middle East into the violent and sectarian mess that it has become. It was not always like this. To deal with the Middle East today, we need to understand the history which made it so. It became violent and sectarian due in large part to the greed and ideological violence of some Europeans and some Middle Easterners before, during, and as a result of the Great War. Thank you for listening.